Welcome back to the Introduction to Research. This is part 2 of the podcast. As a reminder, the last podcast we went over definitions for what research is, and as a reminder, research is just a systematic way of learning about something and making sure that what we learn is actually true. And then we conduct research just to learn something, to make us better practitioners at something, and to just give us information on how things really are. So this podcast will focus in on the steps of research, or how to conduct research. Maybe you remember way back in your high school or science days, if you took some science classes, a thing called a scientific method. The scientific method's been around a long time, and scientists still use the scientific method, and we will use the scientific method in our class here. I'm going to actually break it down a little bit more than what I have here in the next part of this lecture. But basically, as the textbook talks about, there are 4 steps in the scientific method. The first step is first developing a problem. You're interested in something, you want to learn more about a particular topic, and maybe you've done some reading, and you're just naturally curious about something, and so you want to know about how to teach better, for example. Oh, I forgot to say, this is also known as problem identification. And so we'll use the ideal of what are effective teaching methods. Then after that, you continue doing reading of journal articles and research, and based on everything you learn from your reading, you formulate a hypothesis, also a prediction of what you think will happen. If you do a study or an experiment, again, a hypothesis is just an educated guess what you think will happen. Then in the next step is you actually conduct a study, whatever that study or experiment may be. And so you're gathering all the data from your study, and then you analyze and interpret what those results from your study means. And you make conclusions based on from the data, when you analyze and interpret the data. We have to go back and look at our hypothesis. Was the hypothesis or the prediction that we made, was it correct or incorrect? In your textbook, the textbook breaks down the scientific method into more steps. You might want to have your textbook open to the page that this chart came from. It's towards the end of chapter 1, because I'm going to go over each one of these steps, because I think this chart is a little bit more relative to what we're going to do in this class, and how we actually do a research study, or even with a research project. So we have 9 steps. I'm going to try to give you examples to follow along with these steps. It's similar to the scientific method. Our first step is to identify a research problem. Again, you're interested, you want to learn something about something, and the example I'm going to give you is effective teaching methods. You took the advanced methods of teaching physical education, and you found it interesting that there are different styles of teaching in the spectrum of teaching. I wonder which one's more effective than the other. Is commands really the best for how I teach physical education? Maybe it's not. Maybe one of the other teaching styles in the spectrum of teaching is better. So that's your problem. Effective teaching methods of the spectrum of teaching. Then the next thing is to do is read as much as you possibly can about all the different teaching styles and the theories of teaching. How, if we're talking about K through 12, how kids learn, that should be pedagogy. If you're in a college level, it'd be adult learning theory. And so what is the most effective thing? Then after you do your literature review, you actually develop a hypothesis. In the example I'll give for a hypothesis, again, hypothesis is an educational guess. We'll say that your hypothesis is command style is more effective than reciprocal style in teaching the overhead volleyball serve to 7th grade students. So what you're saying is you believe that command style is more effective than reciprocal style. All right, sounds good. Then after that, we want to specify a purpose for your research. This is also known as developing a purpose statement. And the example I'll give for that, which you'll see in a lot of the journal articles, is the purpose of this study is to determine if command style is more effective than reciprocal style in teaching the overhead volleyball serve to 7th grade students. It follows right along with your hypothesis, which makes sense. And after we develop the hypothesis, come up with a purpose statement, there's another thing that's implied in here, which I shouldn't assume that, is in this steps 3 and 4, you're also going to develop a research question. A research question for what we have here is command style more effective than reciprocal style in teaching overhead volleyball serve to 7th grade students? Question mark, because we've got to answer a question. All right. So number 5 is we need to develop, in a book they call them operational definitions. We also need to develop delimitations, limitations, and assumptions. I'm going to go over this a little bit more in a future lecture, but I'll touch on it here. Definitions are things that the reader needs to understand, specifically what we're talking about. And in our example study, we would need to define the command style of teaching. We just provide a definition for that. Define reciprocal style. We would have to define the overhead volleyball serve. We would even have to define 7th grade students. Okay, those are just definitions of terms that everybody needs to be clear on. The delimitations are those individuals who are going to take place in a study, are going to be in a study. And it's a weird word, I don't know why they use it. But we're delimiting the study to 7th grade boys and girls. And the other limitation would be the school site and all those type of things. The limitations are the things that make your study not so good. So some of the limitations of our proposed study could be the kids being sick, so they miss, lack of motivation on the kids for whatever reason. Maybe you just have a really small class size. So just things that make your study not too good. And the last one is assumptions. These are things that you, just like the word says, you are assuming about your study. For example, you're going to assume that all kids will try equally on the skills that you are teaching them. They're all motivated again on learning the volleyball overhead serve. Okay, so the next thing we would do is develop methods to test our hypothesis, and I'll give you an example of that. Basically, we would do what's called a pre-test, post-test design, where we pre-test. Actually, we would have 3 different classes. We have Class A, we would teach using the command style only. Class 2, they would be taught the class using a reciprocal style. And the 3rd class, so you would just teach it the normal way you would do it. It couldn't be command, so it'd just be your normal way that you would teach it. You would pre-test all the students on the volleyball overhand serve. You have to develop a way to test that. Do the lesson for whatever number of weeks that you would actually do the lesson for. Then you would do a post-test at the end of that time that you'd say you did it for a week or 2 weeks. That's step 7 is collecting the data. We develop the methods, we collect all the data. Number 8 is we would analyze the data. Okay, we would determine if there was an increase in their scores between the pre-test and the post-test. If there was for the command style, but there wasn't for the reciprocal style, we can say that the command style was more effective than the reciprocal style. Or if it was reversed, reciprocal students did better than the command students, then we would say that the reciprocal students' style was better for teaching that particular skill. So that's the analyzing and interpreting the data. And the last step there is reporting and evaluating the research. That means we actually write it up, report it to somebody, turn it into a journal article, go present it at a conference to tell other people what you learned.